Dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes, back on the TV with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. Do you have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
already to bless.
Yeah. Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nicola Sturgeon's exit leaves an enormous vacuum in Scottish politics. What or who might fill it? A chance for other parties or a new SNP figure to rise up through the squabbles that will inevitably ensue? We're exploring that question today, and has Labour's expenses attack backfired on its own MPs? Plus, a little bit of space, all to come after the headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's just gone 9:30. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. The search for a new First Minister of Scotland is underway after Nicola Sturgeon announced her decision to stand down after 8 years in the job. She plans to remain in office until her successor is elected. The SNP's Executive Committee will meet this evening to draw up a timetable for the leadership race. Possible replacements include the Deputy First Minister John Swinney and Finance Secretary Kate Forbes. A new method of screening ambulance calls is to be introduced in England in an effort to reduce waiting times. Ambulance crews will now review Category 2 calls, which are not immediately life-threatening, to see if the patient can be treated elsewhere. These calls include things like heart attacks, strokes and lesser emergencies like burns and severe headaches. A doctor, nurse or paramedic will call back around 40% of these patients to see if there's an alternative to sending an ambulance. Ministers have announced an extra £421 million to boost alcohol and drug treatment and recovery across England. The new funding will be given to 151 councils to fund initiatives aimed at tackling addiction and cutting crime, such as recruiting more staff, better recovery support for prison leavers and investment in treatment. The government says it could prevent nearly 1,000 drug-related deaths. British gas owner Centrica has posted profits of £3.3 billion, more than triple what it made the year before. It comes after Ofgem launched an urgent inquiry to investigate the company for installing prepayment meters by force in vulnerable customers' homes. Liberal Democrat leader Sir Ed Davey has called the announcement a betrayal for British gas customers across the country and called on the government to implement a proper windfall tax. And Labour is promising to recruit an extra 13,000 community police officers to tackle antisocial behaviour and violent crime if they win the next election. The Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper will be speaking in the next half an hour and is expected to announce the Neighbourhood Policing Guarantee, which will assign officers and PCSOs to every community in a bid to increase police visibility. You're up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, yesterday, in a move that many had been anticipating, but perhaps not so soon, Nicola Sturgeon resigned from her post as First Minister of Scotland. Now, in a long-winded speech, Sturgeon eventually said she'd stay on until a next leader is elected, but speculation, of course, is growing over who that might be. Unlike in 2014, when Sturgeon stood unopposed as the protégé of Alex Salmond, there's no immediately obvious successor to take on the role. And a power vacuum now exists in Scotland. Who or what might fill it? Well, I'm delighted to be joined this morning to discuss this by Alistair Carmichael, the MP for Orkney and Shetland, former Secretary of State for Scotland during the coalition government as well. Alistair, thank you for joining me. You have the one of the rare honours of being a Scottish MP who has actually retained your seat for more than the last decade. You have been up there in Orkney and Shetland and really see a tumultuous change come in terms of, in 2010, the Labour Party almost sweeping the board in Scotland. In 2015, the SNP winning all but 3 seats. Is that sort of a flash in the pan? Or does the SNP's hold over Scotland stretch beyond one central figure?
Well, that, I think, is what we're about to learn, isn't it? There has been a growing feeling in the last few weeks and months, actually, that it was all beginning to catch up with the SNP and that the baggage of 15 years of government without really a brilliant record of delivery was beginning to be found out. So, you know, we shall see what comes next. The SNP remain in a massively dominant position in Scotland. But then again, as you say, that was where the Labour Party was until 2015. Change sometimes when it comes can come at a quite remarkable rate and in a very dramatic way. I think, though, that, you know, any objective analysis will tell you that with Nicola Sturgeon gone, there is no obvious successor, and that may ultimately be the biggest weakness of her legacy.
It's interesting because other parties across the United Kingdom have had in recent years a bit of a torrid time when they've had leadership elections. We saw the blue on blue over the summer did no favours for the Conservative Party's poll ratings, and similarly back in 2015 the Labour Party sort of had an internal spasm really and produced Jeremy Corbyn as leader. Might we see some yellow-on-yellow Scottish nationalist action, some candidates really chasing after the most extreme parts of their narrow selectorate?
I think that's eminently possible. I can tell you, because I sit behind them in the House of Commons every day when the House is sitting, that there are a lot of divisions, and very deep and occasionally very bitter divisions within that SNP group at Westminster, which I think reflect the divisions within the party themselves. Nicola Sturgeon, by sheer force of personality and a significant amount of political skill, was able to manage these divisions, to hold the whole thing together. But even she has been struggling lately. You know, when you see SNP MPs blocking each other on Twitter, then you know that actually everything is not all happy in that camp.
It seemed like Nicola Sturgeon's grip over the SNP has been weakening in recent weeks, recent months, with the ousting of Ian Blackford down in Westminster. Now, you're saying you sit just behind that SNP grouping. What was your sense in terms of how that sort of coup took place amongst the SNP group? How, indeed, Stephen Flynn took on the role, because he's not an ally of Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, so we're told, and indeed I understand that to be the case. Exactly how these things happen, they still keep fairly tight. I mean, the defining characteristic of the SNP in 2015 was that they had this Stalinist discipline within their group, and you know they moved almost in lockstep, literally and politically. That has started to unravel in recent times. As for Ian Blackford, I think there was a combination of, yes, Ian was seen as being a proxy for unhappiness with other things that Nicola Sturgeon was doing with her leadership, especially this quite bizarre idea of using the next election as a de facto referendum on Scottish independence. But also there were elements there that within the group he wasn't seen as being as effective as they wanted. And, you know, I think it was a combination of all these things that came to the boiling point and meant that he left not in as bad a way as he might have done, but certainly it was not exactly one of the more dignified exits I've ever seen in politics.
Now, clearly there were many different factors that led to Nicola Sturgeon's resignation yesterday, but one of the most recent and perhaps the most public was this issue over Gender Recognition Act reform, something that, of course, the United Kingdom government decided to block, and something that Nicola Sturgeon seemed to get into a bit of a muddle over when interviewed about. Does it now damage the cause of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Labour Party in that they backed the SNP's legislation over gender reform?
No, look, our MSPs did support it, but the party as a whole, as I recall, actually made it a free vote, and I think that was a sensible and reasonable thing to do. I think the mistake that Nicola Sturgeon made there was then trying to do what they had done with everything else for the last 8 years and turn it from an issue about the rights of transgender people into a constitutional issue. And that, you know, suddenly we weren't talking about what was the appropriate age for a gender recognition certificate to be granted or any of that sort of stuff. But it was all yet again about independence, and it was trying to widen that gap and grow that sense of grievance. And for the first time, you know, in any significant way, they failed in generating that sense of grievance. And, you know, I think in many ways that kind of caught them blindsided. So, you know, that's something that will be at the top of the in tray for the incoming First Minister, I've no doubt.
So just finally in this conversation, Alistair Carmichael, was the United Kingdom government right? Was Alistair Jack and Rishi Sunak right in their decision to block that reform in an extraordinary and unprecedented move?
No, I mean, personally, I think there are other things that they could have done. There are other mechanisms within the Scotland Act. I think the Section 35 order is, effectively the sledgehammer to crack a nut. And they too politicised this and tried to make it a constitutional issue. So I think both the government in Edinburgh and the government in London have a lot of sharing of the blame to do there. In the time that I was in government, and indeed for the years that you had Labour and Liberal Democrats in a administration in the Scottish Parliament, we always sought to make devolution work by getting the governments to work together, because inevitably there will always be an overlap between the functions of government in London and in Holyrood. As long as you do that, as long as you have the political will to make devolution work, it can do some quite remarkable things for people in Scotland. But if instead you see it as being the opportunity to grow the division, widen the splits, then in fact at the end of the day it's the people and the services that they rely on that lose out.
Well, Alistair Carmichael, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really appreciate your thoughts over this enormous issue. Let's get the reaction now of the Deputy Political Editor of The Mirror, Ben Glaze, who joins me in the studio. And that was, to me, interesting. Alistair Carmichael saying that actually, despite everything that's happened, despite what some might argue the political success of Rishi Sunak's decision there with the Section 35 order, the Lib Dems still not saying that it was the right thing to do.
No, it is interesting because the Labour and the Lib Dems, I understand there was a free vote up in Holyrood. Often at Westminster, such issues are dealt with as matters of conscience, whereby a party doesn't take a line. And obviously with the SNP, there was a resignation from Nicola Sturgeon's cabinet over this. But it has proved a hugely divisive issue. And by the British government citing Section 35, and deciding to block it as not compatible with UK-wide equality legislation, it sort of teed up this confrontation between Westminster and Holyrood on this particular issue, which has, proved so divisive across the UK generally.
It clearly has widened these fissures that we were already seeing within the SNP. Alistair Carmichael there talking about SNP MPs blocking each other on social media. I mean, this is an extraordinary position for the party that was once so united, so disciplined in its message. It's really fallen apart.
That's right. I remember just in the aftermath of the 2015 general election when the SNP took 56 out of 59 seats in Scotland and Labour was reduced to just one instead of the 41 that they won in the 2010 general election. These SNP MPs came down to Westminster all wearing their yellow lanyards and, they were seen as this really united group. And obviously over the last 7.5 years, that's really started to split. And a lot of that is around the strategy that Nicola Sturgeon has decided to pursue in going after a second independence referendum to try and split up the UK. Now, she wants to treat the next general election as a de facto second referendum, so that if there's a 50% plus one majority for nationalist parties supporting independence, that will be seen as Scotland voting for independence. You recall, of course, in September 2014, the No campaign won by 55% to 45% when Scotland opted to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, next month, there was due to be a special conference of SNP members basically to rubber stamp this idea that the next general election be a de facto referendum. But there's big opposition to it within the SNP. And now it's unclear whether or not that conference will take place because Nicola Sturgeon, in her speech yesterday, where she announced that decision to resign, she said it wouldn't be right for her to be the leader when she's developed that strategy and she thought she might be tied personally to it.
Really interesting to see what candidates will pop up and whether or not they'll be vocally in support of that or otherwise. No doubt it will be a big dividing line in the weeks and potentially months ahead. Ben Glaze, stay with us because we will be returning to you with the other big issues of today. But next today, do you remember the so-called GPC files? Yes, the big push on government procurement that the Labour Party made on Monday morning. The party changed the name of their Twitter account to the GPC Files and produced a website showing what the civil service had been spending on with their government procurement cards. But it wasn't long before some of these allegations began to backfire. Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, was left in the awkward position of defending her own expense claims for expensive Apple consumer technology like AirPods Pro, all while she criticised the Foreign Office for booking posh restaurants or first-class hotels. Yes, when Labour began to open that Pandora's box of expenses stories, they opened a big risk that the public would simply say, a plague on all your houses. And it turns out now that the reputed author of Labour's GPC files dossier is none other than Damien McBride, the former spin doctor to Gordon Brown. And he has helpfully written a book all about his time in the last Labour government, including the extensive hospitality expenses that the Labour Party then racked up. Well, the Guido Fawkes website has dug up this material, and I'm delighted to say that Paul Staines, its founder and editor, joins me live in the studio. Paul, this seems to have backfired a little bit for Labour.
Yeah, I think the CIA use a term from the oil industry called blowback when they politically intervene in a third world country and their intervention blows back in their face in the way that a drill hole with the gas going out explodes. And I think, in some ways, as soon as this started, people started going, well, what about when Labour were in charge? These government procurement cards, the debit card for spending, were a useful innovation. And because of transparency that came in under David Cameron, we can now look at all these bills. So we're looking back at old things. And Ed Balls, Damien McBride's old pal, when he was Education Minister, was racking up in all the best restaurants in Westminster. Some I enjoy very much, but in my case, the taxpayer doesn't get harmed. And we're talking about £1,000 meals that Ed Balls, I don't know who he was taking out. Was he taking out union bosses? Was he taking out teachers? I can understand when the Foreign Office spends a lot on entertainment and cocktail parties.
If there's foreign dignitaries, you might want to
I don't think President Macron is going to be happy going to McDonald's. But I don't understand why an education minister is having these kind of entertainment expenses. And then in that book you referred to, Power Trip by Damien McBride, he talks about when he's over in Washington and New York with Gordon Brown, how he goes out to bars.
We have some of these quotes here that we can show on the screen. This is from Damien McBride's book, Power Trip. If we chartered a flight from BA, Virgin, or one of the occasional private airlines we used, then all the food and booze we'd normally consume was on the flight was obviously thrown in as well. He also wrote, we'd drive out to Summers Restaurant and Sports Bar in Arlington on Saturday mornings, Sunday lunchtimes and weekday afternoons to catch any live Premiership or Champions League games. Gordon wouldn't drink. Well, that's saying that Gordon wouldn't drink, but no doubt the advisers would. I mean, this really is interesting because so many of the people that were there at the top of the Brown administration are now back in running the Labour Party.
Correct. So I had a look at the archives and dug out some of the things that the old shadow cabinet were up to. The current shadow cabinet, who were actually ministers 10, 15, where are we? Almost 20 years ago. And Yvette Cooper, for instance, Ed Balls' wife, she had to repay back mortgage payments. They flipped their house. Do you remember flipping houses where where the taxpayer paid your mortgage, then you sold the house at the profit and bought another one, and the cycle started going 3 times.
And she's now the Shadow Home Secretary who's making a big speech later this morning. Why do you think that these big questions have sort of been forgotten? They've had some time out of power, and now it's like they've got a blank slate.
I think what Damien's mistake here was that he thought that he could paint Rishi as a free-spending, private jet flying character, forgetting his old days flying on private jets, and that we would go back in the archives. So I think the public, the voters, are going to go, they're all the same.
Well, let's bring in Ben Glaze now to this conversation, because do you think that there is always a risk when any politician of any party says, look what these other guys are doing on expenses? I mean, they're all doing it, aren't they?
It is a risk, yeah. I mean, people in glass houses don't throw stones, is the recommendation. Some Labour figures, when they were trying to sell the GPC files as being dubbed, trying to compare it to the expenses scandal from 2008. I mean, this is not the expenses scandal. It doesn't look great when you've got taxpayer-funded stays in five-star hotels and meals costing thousands of pounds. No, we don't want to pay for that. You know, when you see your pay slip and you see how much has gone out each month in tax, you don't want it to be funding champagne-fueled dinners in glitzy restaurants in New York or wherever else. But you do accept that you are going to have to fund some stuff, like Paul says, when you've got visiting dignitaries. Although the idea of Emmanuel Macron having a Big Mac, I'm all for that. French fries as well, obviously.
Oh, fantastic. Well, at least we haven't renamed them freedom fries, as the United States did in the wake of the Iraq War. But I wonder, when we look at this in the round, why has the Labour Party chosen now to do it? It seemed to sort of all disappear by the middle of this week. Do you think they've understood that perhaps it wasn't the wisest path to go down?
I don't know, well, news changes, isn't it? I mean, there are, if you dig around in those files, there are other stories waiting to be written, I'm sure. But things like Nicola Sturgeon's resignation yesterday and the far more important story, really, of Jeremy Corbyn. That's more important for Labour, perhaps, than exposing a few Tory ministers spending lavishly on these government procurement cards. You know, if people recognise Jeremy Corbyn, they'll know about that. That will mean more to them, and certainly for Keir Starmer, showing how he's reshaped the Labour Party, that's more important, I think.
Well, a final word to you, Paul Staines, on this entire story. Is this the last we're going to hear of expenses? Will people sort of step back now in terms of thinking this is all too hot to touch?
I would be surprised if they carry on with this, but just... It's recess week, so we're a bit still short of news. I mean, usually when Parliament's in recess, there's not many political stories.
We talk about UFOs and the like.
Exactly. But we've had Sturgeon, we've had the Corbyn thing. But we've got a few more of these from the archives for today.
Interesting. We'll keep an eye out. Paul Staines, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Finally, today, the United Kingdom Space Agency has announced £6.5 million in levelling up funding for 18 space projects that support local growth across the UK. Now, these projects are supposed to harness space-enabled technology to address local priorities, if that makes any sense at all. I'm delighted to be joined by David Morris, the MP for Morecambe, and the UK government's first national space champion. So, David Morris, how does space fit in with local levelling up?
Well, you'd be surprised. The space industry in the UK is not just about, the real sexy things that people see, like rockets and man on the moon, the Artemis program. It's about what actually makes those projects work. The technology, where it comes from. And we've got a lot of SMEs in the UK that are pioneering. We've got Earth observation SMEs that make satellites that we can launch and just check on what's going on in real time. So it's technology like that. I mean, to give you an example, your car, your sat nav. I mean, I can remember the first sat navs that we used to buy from Halfords. I mean, they've come on in leaps and bounds. I mean, I hired a car the other week, and I couldn't believe it. I know it was all cameras, trickery and everything else, but it all came from satellite technology, where it actually showed the car on my drive reversing out. So these are things that we actually do take for granted, but does start small and then gets very, very big.
Now, the UK space sector took a bit of a PR hit, of course, when the Virgin orbital launch didn't quite go to plan. We've now had some news about what quite went wrong. Is this a setback for the United Kingdom?
Well, whenever you're dealing with any launch vehicle, you're going to have some kind of a problem. Even when they get into orbit, there's always some kind of a problem. I believe in this case, it was a fuel filter. That's what I've read. I've not seen any official reports yet, but that's what I did read. So if you think about the testing that goes into these rockets, you're just seeing the product that goes up. That's happened quite a few times. And, there's yet to be more to come out on that, I'm absolutely certain. But like everything else, we're building rockets here in the UK to be sort of launched terrestrially and vertically into orbit from our shores or around our shores. So, we're in a position now where, OK, it was, putting it bluntly, quite a setback, but it doesn't mean it's going to stop there.
It's such an interesting sector because, of course, it's something the United Kingdom was really leading on back in the 1950s. We were sort of third in the race behind the United States and the Soviet Union. We were the third country in the world to launch, orbital-class satellites. And then we just threw it all away. Are we now really getting back up there with the big guys? Is there a possibility here that the UK can really excel?
I think that, in all honesty, you're right what you're saying about 1950s when we had our own launch pads in Woomera. And, one of my uncles was out there all them years ago in the 1950s watching things going on. So, we did sort of miss a trick where we stepped back and let the Americans and the Russians basically fight it out in the Cold War with all the resources they had and all the technological advances that they were doing. But, we still did have scientists, British scientists, working on those projects that have led us to where we are today. So we're just trying to sort of claim back some of that territory in the respect of using the technology that we did have in the 1950s, which is still valid and still current, albeit updated, to take it a stage further and obviously get the UK back into the space race.
Well, really interesting stuff there. David Morris, the first national space champion for the UK, an MP for Morecambe. Thanks for joining us on the briefing this morning. Really interesting stuff there. Just finally, Ben Glaze. Rishi Sunak is obviously really focused on science, innovation and technology. There's a new department for it. Is space going to be a bigger part of the UK going forward?
I think it's really interesting listening to what Dave Morris was saying there because, we did fall back in the race, certainly behind the Americans and the Russians. And then we all got excited a few weeks back with that Virgin launch down at Newquay Airport, Cosmic Girl, the converted Boeing 747, and we couldn't even get that right. There's a lot of work to do, I think.
Let's hope it gets a bit better. Ben Glaze, thank you for joining us all morning, and thank you indeed for staying with us through here on The Briefing. We're back tomorrow at 9:30. Up next, it's Bev Turner.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m.